A wave of parcel bombs aimed at foreign embassies. Anarchists are blamed for a campaign of terror across Europe. But who are these people? What do they want? And is domestic anarchy now going global? This is Inside Story. Hello there, thanks for joining us. I'm Shuli Ghosh. So a parcel bomb was defused by police on Monday outside the Greek embassy in Rome. No one immediately claimed responsibility, but it followed explosions at the Swiss and Chilean embassies last week, in which 2 people were injured. Those attacks were claimed by an Italian group called the Informal Anarchist Federation. It's a shadowy group which Italian intelligence officials describe as being an alliance of organisations united by a belief in revolutionary armed action. Now, the attacks in Rome are similar to those in Greece last month. More than a dozen parcel bombs were sent to various embassies in Athens. Devices were also intercepted on their way to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Those attacks were suspected of being orchestrated by another anarchist group, the Conspiracy of Fire Cells, which was formed during the Greek riots of 2008. Intelligence reports now say there are links between the Italian and Greek organisations. So, who are these people? What do they want? Let me introduce today's guests to hopefully answer those questions. From Rome, James Walston, Professor of International Relations at the American University of Rome. From Athens, Brady Kiesling, a former diplomat for the US Embassy in Athens, who's currently writing a book about political violence in Greece. And from London, we'll get a security analyst and founder of the consultancy group International Corporate Protection. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. James, let's start with you. The FAI, the Italian Informal Anarchist Federation, it's described as being a number of organisations, like-minded organisations. What do they want? What are their aims?
They want to cause instability. Their main aim is to frighten people, frighten the authorities, the Italian authorities and foreign authorities. The numbers are very, very small, and as far as we know, their program is not very clear. They are different from the previous sorts of left-wing terrorism which Italy had a lot of in the 70s and 80s, which were very clearly Marxist-Leninist. The anarchists are, as they say in their own title, very informal. Anarchists are, by definition, informal. But they are, their main aim is to cause instability and to try and make use of the unhappiness which there is in Italy and elsewhere in Europe because of unemployment and because of the crisis.
According to investigators, there was a message found near one of the explosions, James. It reportedly said, this is a message reportedly from the Informal Anarchist Federation, and it said, "We've decided to make our voice heard with words and deeds. Let us destroy the system of domination. Long live the FAI." I mean, if their aim is to create an atmosphere of fear, is that working where you are?
No, it's certainly not working, and what we saw last week, on the contrary, the opposite of it. 2 weeks ago there was a bill before Parliament, there was a vote of no confidence for the government, and there was a lot of disorder, more or less just behind where I'm sitting now, but in various parts of Rome, and some of you might have seen the pictures of it. There were cars ablaze in Via del Corso, in Piazza del Popolo, and it was very ugly. The week later, when the University Reform Bill was due to be passed, there was a lot of fear that there would be the same sort of disorder. But instead, the students' organisations, which are not very well structured, but they're there, they decided to do something completely different. They didn't come into the centre, there was no violence whatsoever, there were demonstrations around the city, getting a lot of public support. And at the same time, the President Napolitano invited some of them to come in and talk to him. So it was diffused very much. There's a potential for political violence in this country, and there always will be. But at the moment, it's being kept very much under control.
OK, let's look at whether there are a possibility of links between groups. Brady, we talked about similarities to the attacks that we saw in Greece not so long ago. Is that a similar group, the Conspiracy of Fire Cells? Do they have similar aims?
The conspiracy of fire cells is philosophically very close to the FAI. Basically, however, you have to look at these as little hunting parties, like the old Native Americans, essentially sending smoke signals to each other. They are groups that have some personal contacts. They communicate via the internet to some degree. When one anarchist is arrested in one country, anarchists around the world will rally in solidarity. And these bombs are very specifically acts of solidarity with imprisoned anarchists. We should expect to see a bomb in the Mexican embassy too, because the latest round seems to echo pretty faithfully an attack that in Mexico by the Earth Liberation Front, a similar Mexican anarchist group, again with Swiss, Greek, Italian anarchists, Chilean.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how they choose their targets, because you know, the Swiss embassy was targeted in Greece as it was in Italy. A lot of people will say, well, what have the Swiss done to merit that?
Well, the Swiss are holding some old eco-terrorists that were arrested. I forget the details, but in solidarity with this group, the other groups are letting off little bombs. And there's no expectation that the bombs will cause any change in government policy, but at least it is a signal to each other. It restores morale. It shows, yes, we are a movement that can make its presence felt.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about solidarity. This particular group, the Conspiracy of Fire Cells, was to all intents and purposes formed after the death of a Greek teenager who was shot dead by police. But those police officers were jailed, weren't they? So what is fueling the continuation of this group's activities?
Actually, to correct the record slightly, the group was formed a year before the death of the teenager in solidarity with some imprisoned Greek anarchists. Essentially, someone was caught torching an ATM machine at a bank. His friends got together and decided that they would humiliate the police by setting fire to banks, police cars, luxury car dealers, until the authorities decided it was a bad idea to keep anarchists in jail. It worked to some small degree, not very well, but then with the large riots in December of 2008, these groups suddenly they were the focal point for a generation of youth who wanted to protest more vigorously, and they began to become more outwardly political. I mean, if you look at their politics is not very inspiring. We can talk about that if you
okay,
like.
I mean, we'll talk about the politics in a moment. I want to bring Will in as a security analyst. First of all, I mean, the aim, as both Brady and James have said, the aim of these groups seems to be to cause chaos, to disorientate, not specifically to cause mass injuries or mass deaths. Do you agree with that?
I think I couldn't agree more, in fact, with your other guests. I think both gentlemen actually put it in a most succinct and articulate way in terms of the smoke signals that are being sent to various other groups around the world. When we look at the Chile embassy, obviously, that was targeted, this was supposedly in response to an anarchist called Mauricio Morales, who died, in fact, carrying a device himself. There is no clarity in many respects with a lot of these groups, and certainly from a security perspective, one of the things that we'll be initially doing would be undertaking a very thorough risk assessment. Who are the group, what are their motivations, and what are they seeking to achieve? In terms of this particular organisation, which, again, one of your guests, I forget which, mentioned that they are operating in a very cellular sense, if you like, as small groups, and in a very unstructured way, again, just sort of reiterates the fact that there is no clarity in what this group's looking to achieve. Their targets are primarily governmental, and they're primarily embassies and heads of state. But again, what they're seeking to achieve and what specific message they're trying to communicate, again, is very unclear.
Well, they have caused a certain amount of concern from governments. This is what the Italian Interior Minister Roberto Moroni said. He said these groups are very violent. They're present in Spain and Greece as well as Italy, and they're closely linked. Now, given that governments think that they're closely linked, I understand your point about them all being sort of, you know, little individual independent groups. But is there a certain amount of coordination between these groups? And if so, could that lead to a bigger, wider concern about what they could do, what they could achieve?
Well, yes, it could do, and certainly theoretically that's something that's going to have to be considered with any countermeasures to these types of attacks. But again, these types of attacks are no different in many respects in modus operandi to the sort of countermeasures many embassies will be taking against international terrorism. The attacks themselves, yes, they have been low level, albeit they have been improvised explosive devices. These two most recent incidents involved obviously devices contained within a video cassette box powered by a 9-volt battery with shards of metal and gunpowder. Now, these would cause potentially very serious injury to whoever handled these devices. So, again, this is a very first step, if you like, in potentially an escalation to greater actions.
James, what do you think about that? I mean, the feeling seems to be that the politics are woolly. There doesn't seem to be any sort of, main goal that they're going to, but there could be this growing coordination between these various angry groups who've got various grievances, which could lead to a bigger problem in the long term.
Well, I think there are much bigger problems of political violence in Italy and around the rest of Europe, much more visible ones. The numbers of the anarchists are very small. Their firepower is relatively low. Certainly a cassette bomb, video cassette bomb, can do serious injury to a single individual, but this is not massive violence, thank goodness. And it obviously will raise security levels. I think the quote you gave us from Maroni is something you would expect from a Ministry of the Interior. The authorities on the whole will use, anywhere in the world, will use this type of political violence in order to increase their own security levels to deal with other forms of instability and political violence.
I mean, it's not just the Interior Minister. Italian investigators did a report saying anarchism has gone global. This is what Italian investigators said, and Greece is now a strategic base for Italian revolutionaries. That sounds pretty serious.
Well, anarchism has always been global, right from the beginning. In some ways, there's much more in common with Conrad's The Secret Agent of more than 100 years ago, and Russian anarchists at the middle of the 19th century. They had their international links. They weren't with the internet, of course, but they were linked, and they did try and coordinate their actions, and they did attack high-profile targets. So in that sense, we're much more. The methods are 21st century, but the aims are 19th century. Yes, of course they're global, and it is very easy for groups in Chile to contact those in Greece. It's very easy for Italians to move to Greece anywhere within the Schengen area. So terrorists can move just as easily as legitimate workers. So in that sense there are risks, but I think I do repeat that the risks of political violence in this country and elsewhere are much greater from the discontent caused by the economic downturn, which could lead to other forms of terrorism.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder whether, Brady, I mean, Greece in particular has had such an economic crisis, very, very high-profile protests and anger towards the government. Is there a tie-in there between the austerity budgets that we've seen and the complete economic down spiral in Greece and the recent campaign of letter bombs?
There's no connection between those campaigns. It's important to realize that the Greek anarchists behind the latest letter bombs are people whose program is to overthrow the state, society, the church, the family. It's everything that is somehow a barrier to individual human freedom. Obviously, this is not a practical political program, and they don't treat it as one. They're not particularly interested in the economic downturn, except in one way. There are huge protests in Greece now, mostly peaceful ones, but those protests are a crowd that anarchists can hide behind in an attempt to spread violence relatively safely.
Possibly recruit more sympathy towards the anarchists' aims?
Except that The people who have joined these, the protests are mostly people whose economic future is on the line. And the anarchists basically say, working for a living is for saps. We want freedom, a society where no one has to work for a living. And I'm afraid if you're an unemployed bank clerk, that message is not going to resonate with you.
Will,
and it doesn't resonate in Greece.
What do you make of that? And I mean, Brady's saying no link between the economic, or no direct link between the economic downturn and anarchic aims. Is there perhaps a link between the increasing number of protests we're seeing around Europe and these groups?
Well, I think Brady's point is completely valid. I think where many of the demonstrations, and particularly the sort of the groundswell of disenchanted individuals in terms of the economic reforms or economic downturns, I think where that works to the anarchist advantage, as we've seen many, many times before, and regardless of whatever agenda any demonstration might potentially be supporting or purporting, is where anarchists can utilize that as camouflage. Now, I think what we may see is, as there is this groundswell of disenchantment towards economic downturns right across Europe and across the world in many respects, we could see, as we saw with the student protest here in London, where anarchists will infiltrate in greater numbers, or certainly in a more precise and tactical way, to utilize those as camouflage for them to undertake their own individual actions.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned the student protests, Will, because I wanted to bring this up because it seems to me that the growing anger towards governments during the economic crisis was highlighted during the recent student protests in London following that huge increase in tuition fees. Now, interestingly, there's a YouTube clip which has now gone viral, which features a 15-year-old British student warning that people are prepared to fight back against the establishment. Let's have a listen.
We are now the generation at the heart of the fight back. We are now the generation that will stand with everyone who's fighting back. The most inspiring thing, I think, was that just after Wednesday, hundreds of people joined a Facebook group, school students joined a Facebook group in solidarity with RMT members on strike. Those are people who previously thought tube strikes was something annoying because they stopped them getting into school. Now they think they've got to link arms and fight back with everyone. So we want to show solidarity with everyone who's fighting back. We hope you'll show solidarity with us and send a strong message to this government that they can't throw their cuts at us. We're going to stand up and we're going to fight back.
Now, Will, there's that word again, solidarity. I mean, we're not suggesting for a moment, of course, that students are going to go out and plant letter bombs, but how worried should governments be at that sort of mood of rebellion?
Well, I think certainly, as we saw here in London, I think the government took it incredibly seriously, and they realised that, again, this can spread in many respects amongst the public and the general public at large in terms of their support. However, when we bring this back to the subject of anarchists, and particularly the recent actions and attacks that took place in Rome, it really goes back to what I was saying before about anarchist groups trying potentially to recruit, but I again agree with Brady's point that, again, there's a large proportion of demographic that won't actually align themselves to anarchists. But there are possibilities where anarchists will use these demonstrations, which I think we will see increase as their camouflage for their own individual actions.
Brady, could we see this brand of European rebellion moving across to the US, for example?
Definitely we can see it. The various groups make a large point of idealizing the successful rebellions in each other's countries. The December 8th riots of 2008 have become legend in the American anarchist community. In fact, we recently had an American anarchist injured in a protest here. She had come basically on anarchism tourism, to join what she saw in Greece as this mecca for insurrection. That said, because there's so little practical, positive political program behind the groups, they cannot unite for any length of time. They cannot find targets that resonate with the general population. They are essentially a marginal lifestyle, and they will stay that way for the foreseeable future.
You see, it's interesting. I'm still confused about what it is that they want. If they want to overthrow government, establishment, church, and have independent freedom, I mean, what kind of society do they want?
Well, that's the problem. They know how they personally want to live. And in Athens, there are a number of anarchist squats, abandoned houses that have been taken over, some communes, some of them quite successful with little printing plants, art shops, people who find, ways to earn a living. You have other squats that are populated by people who make a living by robbing banks. There are groups of anarchists, the so-called illegals, who do work for organized crime groups and in exchange get weapons. But it's a whole spectrum of behaviors on the margins of society that has a steady trickle of recruits, but never has any hope of appealing to a broad audience and becoming a political force in Greece, unless the Greek state becomes hysterical and overreacts.
James, presumably you agree with that, although presumably the atmosphere in Rome right now is one of heightened security.
There's a lot more security in the embassies, but what is surprising is, as I think I said earlier, that the big demonstrations which we had last week and the week before have shown how this type of discontent can be dealt with on both sides, on the student side and on the side of the authorities. And the Italian language for revolt has always been much more Marxist-Leninist. There have been, in the Second World War, the resistance, where there was a lot of communist resistance. In the '68 movement and the terrorism that came out of the '68 movement, it was all far more organized in a Marxist way and a communist way. The people that we're talking about now, as both Brady and Will have said, are far more disorganized, and they have a far weaker plan of action. They know they want to cause trouble, but after that, what do? And this is not at all clear, and it makes them far less powerful. It's a worry, but it's a worry for the police rather than for the whole of society.
Will, I just wonder, on a slight tangent, is there kind of a feeling that, okay, these groups are a concern, but they're not Islamic groups. This isn't extremist Muslims at work here, therefore we won't worry about it too much?
I think that would be naive for any group to potentially approach this in terms of an attitude. Anarchist groups, I think we're all agreed, are these very fragmented, disillusioned groups and individuals.
Yeah, I say it because
really
there has
no
been
clear agenda,
such a concentration on, Islamic terrorism, for want of a better word, and I wonder whether the governments have been caught on the back foot slightly, perhaps.
I don't think so. I mean, I think in terms of all the countermeasures that will be made in terms of both anti and counter-terrorism measures, these will all encompass all these types of random types of threats as well. That they will look at all the surveillance detection issues that would detect, obviously, the reconnaissance that will be undertaken, whether it be by an international terrorist group or whether it be by an anarchist group. Again, a lot of the attack cycles, the planning cycles by all types of threat groups that are planning an attack will be very similar, albeit in certain groups will be more sophisticated. But in terms of how they repel those types of attacks, again, whether it be an anarchist that's sending through a parcel bomb or whether it be an Al-Qaeda affiliated group, the same measures should apply. So again, there will be some big questions being raised in both the Swiss and the Chilean embassies in terms of how they're handling packages which are being delivered to them, and that could have easily been sent by an Al-Qaeda group.
Gentlemen, a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed for your time. In Rome, James Woolston. In Athens, Brady Kiesling. And in London, Will Geddes. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. If you do have any comments about today's show, then email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, from me, Shuli Ghosh, bye-bye for now.